In July of 2015, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Its founder, Elizabeth Holmes, owned roughly half of it. That made her, on paper, the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. She was 31 years old. She had dropped out of Stanford at 19. She had no medical degree, no clinical training, and no published research. 3 months later, a single newspaper article would reveal that the blood testing technology her entire company was built around did not work, had never worked, and could not work. Sitting on the board of directors of that $9 billion company were 2 former United States Secretaries of State, 2 former Secretaries of Defense, a former Senate Majority Leader, a 4-star admiral, a 4-star Marine General, and the former chairman of Wells Fargo. Between them, those men had run the Cold War, the war in Iraq, the U.S. Treasury, the State Department in 3 administrations, and the largest consumer bank in America. Their combined experience in medical diagnostics, in laboratory science, in clinical trials, in regulatory affairs, in any field remotely connected to what Theranos claimed to do, was zero. This is the story of how the most decorated boardroom in modern American corporate history sat for nearly a decade inside a company that was a fraud, and the question is not whether they should have known. The question is whether the board itself was the reason no one else found out sooner. Elizabeth Holmes founded the company that would become Theranos in 2003. She was 19 years old and had spent 2 semesters as a chemical engineering student at Stanford. Her idea was simple to describe and, as a matter of physics and chemistry, almost certainly impossible. A small device, the size of a desktop printer, that could run hundreds of laboratory blood tests from a single drop of blood drawn from a fingertip. For the first 8 years of the company's life, almost no one outside of Silicon Valley had heard of it. Holmes raised money quietly from a small circle of venture investors. Tim Draper, Don Lucas, the family of Larry Ellison, most of whom knew her family socially and none of whom had any background in medical devices. The turning point came in 2011. Don Lucas, the chairman of the Theranos board, introduced Holmes to a neighbor of his in Palo Alto, George Shultz. George Shultz was, at that point, 90 years old. He had served as Secretary of Labor under Nixon, Secretary of the Treasury under Nixon and Ford, and Secretary of State under Reagan. He had negotiated the end of the Cold War. He was a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and he was, by any measure, one of the most influential elder statesmen in American public life. Holmes asked Shultz to join her board. Shultz, who later told reporters he believed Theranos could save millions of lives, said yes. And then he began making phone calls. Within 3 years, Shultz had personally recruited to the Theranos board Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, Sam Nunn, the former chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, James Mattis, who had just retired as the 4-star general commanding U.S. Central Command, Gary Roughead, the former chief of naval operations, Bill Frist, the former Senate Majority Leader and a heart transplant surgeon, and Richard Kovacevic, the former chief executive of Wells Fargo. The Theranos board, by 2015, looked less like a corporate board than like a National Security Council in retirement. Of the 12 directors, exactly one, Fabrizio Bonanni, a former executive at Amgen, had ever worked at a medical products company. Holmes had not assembled a board. She had assembled a wall. A board of directors has, on paper, one job. It is supposed to govern. It hires and fires the chief executive. It reviews the financial statements. It interrogates the strategy. It is, in theory, the mechanism by which a company's owners hold its operators accountable. The Theranos board did almost none of these things. According to later sworn testimony from multiple directors, board meetings rarely focused on the company's technology, its laboratory results, its clinical validation data, or its regulatory exposure. They focused on geopolitics. Henry Kissinger discussed China. James Mattis discussed Iran. George Shultz discussed nuclear non-proliferation. Elizabeth Holmes, at the head of the table, listened. The board's actual function, as it turned out, was not governance. It was legitimacy. In 2010, when Walgreens was considering a partnership that would put Theranos blood testing kiosks inside thousands of American drugstores, Walgreens hired an outside laboratory consultant, Kevin Hunter, to evaluate the technology. Hunter spent months trying to get straight answers out of Theranos. He concluded the company was hiding something. He recommended Walgreens demand a side-by-side comparison with conventional lab equipment before signing anything. Walgreens signed anyway. The reason given internally, in emails later released during litigation, was not the technology. It was the board. The Walgreens executives believed that a company with George Shultz and Henry Kissinger on its board simply could not, be a fraud, and they were terrified that if they walked away, their competitor, CVS, would sign instead. The same pattern played out at Safeway, which signed a $350 million deal to put Theranos kiosks in its supermarkets, also against the advice of its own due diligence staff. It played out at the Department of Defense, where Marine General James Mattis, while still on active duty and again after retirement, repeatedly pushed Theranos technology for battlefield deployment over the documented objections of military scientists who had reviewed the device and found it unreliable. It played out, most spectacularly, in the press. The 2014 Fortune cover story that introduced Holmes to the American public devoted 3 paragraphs to her board, listing the names in reverent sequence: Shultz, Kissinger, Mattis, Perry, Nunn, and treating the roster itself as a form of proof that the technology must work. No journalist, in the years from 2011 through the middle of 2015, asked the question that any first-year medical student could have asked: where are the peer-reviewed publications validating these results? Where are the FDA clearances? Where is the independent laboratory data? The board was the answer. The board was always the answer. And the board, it turned out, had never asked either. In September 2013, a 23-year-old Stanford biology graduate started a job at Theranos. His name was Tyler Shultz. He was the grandson of George Shultz, the man who had built the Theranos board. Within months, Tyler Shultz noticed that the Edison devices, the proprietary blood analyzers Theranos had spent 10 years developing, were failing quality control tests at rates that, in a normal laboratory, would have triggered an immediate shutdown. He noticed that the company was running most patient samples not on its own devices, but on commercial machines purchased from competitors, while telling the public the opposite. He noticed that the device failure data was being concealed from the FDA. He told his supervisors. He was ignored. He sent a detailed email to Elizabeth Holmes herself. He was told by Theranos president Sunny Balwani to keep his mouth shut. And then, in April 2014, Tyler Shultz did the thing that, in a normal corporate governance system, an employee with concerns is supposed to do. He went to his grandfather, the chairman of the board's Audit and Compliance Committee, the man at the very top of the Theranos governance chain. George Shultz did not listen. Over the next 18 months, as Tyler became a confidential source for John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal, George Shultz repeatedly took Holmes' side over his grandson's. He invited Holmes to his home for Thanksgiving dinner while Tyler was disinvited. He had Theranos lawyers, led by David Boies, follow Tyler, surveil him, and threaten him with litigation that nearly bankrupted his parents. The most senior member of the most prestigious corporate board in America, presented with detailed first-hand evidence of fraud from a witness whose credibility he had no reason to doubt, chose the company, chose the founder, chose, in the end, the legitimacy of the institution he had built. George Shultz never publicly apologized to his grandson. The two men reconciled privately in 2020, shortly before Shultz's death in February 2021. He was 100 years old. The Wall Street Journal published its first investigation on October 15, 2015. It was based in large part on documents Tyler Shultz had carried out of the Theranos building in his head and reconstructed by hand at home. What followed took roughly 6 months. CMS, the federal agency that regulates clinical laboratories, inspected the Theranos facility in Newark, California. They found that the lab was operating in conditions that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health. They revoked the company's certification. The FDA opened an investigation. The SEC opened an investigation. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. Walgreens terminated the partnership and sued for damages. Safeway terminated the partnership and sued for damages. The $9 billion valuation was marked in Forbes' next assessment to zero. In March 2018, the SEC charged Holmes with massive fraud. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted her on 11 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. In January 2022, after a 4-month trial, Holmes was convicted on 4 counts. She was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to a facility in Bryan, Texas, in May 2023. None of the board members were charged with anything. None of them resigned in protest. None of them, at any point, publicly acknowledged that they should have asked harder questions. George Shultz died in 2021 without revising his public statements about Theranos. Henry Kissinger died in 2023, eulogized as a great statesman. His role at Theranos was not mentioned in most obituaries. James Mattis served as United States Secretary of Defense from 2017 to 2018. His Theranos directorship was not raised at his confirmation hearings. Bill Frist returned to surgery. Richard Kovacevic returned to banking. The company itself was dissolved in 2018. Its assets were liquidated to pay creditors. Its patents were sold. Its name became, in the business press, a single-word verb meaning to perpetrate a charismatic fraud. The board members kept their boards. They kept their seats at the table. They kept their reputations, in most cases entirely intact. The standard version of the Theranos story, the one told in documentaries and HBO dramas, is that Elizabeth Holmes was a uniquely talented con artist who fooled a series of distinguished men. This is the comforting version. It is also wrong. Holmes was not a magician. She was a young woman with a chemistry class idea and no ability to execute it. The thing that allowed her fraud to last 12 years, that allowed it to pull in nearly $1 billion in investment, that allowed it to put unvalidated blood test results into the medical files of nearly 1 million American patients, the thing that made all of that possible, was not her. It was the wall of names behind her. A board's job is to govern. The Theranos board was not assembled to govern. It was assembled to be impressive. And once a board's function is to be impressive, governance becomes impossible. The cost of a single skeptical question inside a boardroom full of men accustomed to deference becomes higher than the cost of staying quiet. The reputational risk of being the one who said, "Wait," outweighs the reputational risk of being one of many who said nothing. This is not a feature of Theranos. It is a feature of how prestigious boards work. Walgreens did not validate Theranos' technology because it assumed the board had. Safeway did not validate because it assumed Walgreens had. The Department of Defense did not validate because it assumed the FDA would. The FDA did not aggressively investigate for years because the company was protected by sitting and former cabinet secretaries. Every link in the chain of due diligence pointed at the next link. The board, the famous board, was supposed to be the link of last resort. It turned out to be no link at all. There is a version of this dynamic in every company we've covered on this channel. WeWork's investors deferred to SoftBank. SoftBank deferred to Adam Neumann's reality distortion field. Kodak's directors deferred to 100 years of dividend payments. The mechanism is always the same, a failure mode that depends on everyone assuming someone else has already done the work. George Shultz, near the end of his life, was asked by a journalist whether he regretted his role at Theranos. He said of Elizabeth Holmes, "I still think she's a remarkable person." He died believing it. If this was useful, subscribe. We publish one of these every Friday. Next time, a 50-year-old retailer worth $11 billion, destroyed in 18 months by a single activist investor who did not know what he was doing, and a CEO who agreed with him anyway. Bed Bath & Beyond, coming Friday.